a story which began long before the events of 2020.
Tut.by made its first attempt to disturb the situation in the country back in 2011. We realized that they tried to make an image of an enemy out of the police officer.
How one of the most promising web resources of the country went down to lies, absurdity and provocations. Minus 4 teeth and a black eye.
Was Tut.by really there at that moment, since we saw no third-party journalists there at all? There was an objective of keeping a high degree of tension in the society.
Who moderated the forums on Tut.by?
At some moment it became clear that nothing good will come out of it.
What guidebooks did they follow?
The power rests only on bayonets. I believe it acceptable. These are opinions.
Who was scheming behind the back of the founder of Tut.by? You just don't tell the boss about it. Otherwise, all of us will become self-employed tomorrow. How Zisser's empire was torn apart after his death.
When he was in Riga, Kirill wrote that a one-time payment of 1.5 is planned, which will be followed by 100,000 a month. Yes, exactly.
Who brought the portal to the cemetery of media resources?
Zolotova told me outright that we made our choice. You push people against each other.
Bye-bye, Tut.by. Watch it right now.
The downhill of Tut.by began long before the events of 2020, and the reaction of the resource to the electoral campaign in Belarus to the election of Alexander Lukashenko as president was not an emotional impulse. This is the result of a long and detailed planned work, well tested from 2010 to 2020. Of course, the emergence of such resources Tut.by was due to time. The time has come for fast news, the internet, at the time for reporter mobility. Tut.by was a breakthrough project unlike anything that existed before in Belarus. Reading the materials of the portal, I had an impression that there is creative freedom, special energy, there is some balance. These, in fact, attracted readers from a variety of categories, from students and housewives to civil servants and ordinary hard workers who, coming from work, could open the news feed and learn all the most important things in a day. However, behind the screen of creating a visible balance of interests, there was a completely different game, and at a certain point, the liner called Tut.by began to plunge into the abyss of problems that were created by those who got the steering wheel. After the death of the founder of Tut.by, Yuri Zisser, those very red lines were defiantly broken. This is how the streets of Belarus are like today. This is peaceful life. People are in a hurry for their business, go to the shops. The Tut.by management did its utmost in 2020 to change all that. It didn't work. Stop the violence. Doctors report patients with serious injuries after protests.
A white bracelet was shoved into the girl's mouth. Relatives of the detainees gathered near the detention center at Krestina.
Mom, we were attacked by bandits. In Grodno, a 5-year-old child was injured during a protest.
Minus 4 teeth, a bruised eye. In Grodno, a journalist was detained and beaten, then convicted in 5 minutes.
The second day of protests in Belarus, the first dead at the barricades. This is a story about people who gave birth to the media giant themselves and ruined it, drowning it in personal ambitions and the desire to have more than possible. The editor-in-chief of the resource, Marina Zolotova, appeared on the portal in 2004. It was she who proposed to Zisser creating something more than a mail service with an nondescript news column. That's how the project we know was born. All its ups and downs from that moment were connected with Zolotova, and no matter how strange it may sound, she also organized the funeral of the project.
Marina Zolotova managed the portal permanently, had a huge unquestioned authority on the portal. As a matter of fact, the portal staff called her the mother of Tut.by. She formed a team, she selected journalists, she was in charge of all editorial policy. Not a single decision was made on the portal without her knowledge, in terms of strategy and information development. Let's look, for example, at 2010. The portal was just gaining momentum and approached the elections, though not being the most popular platform in Belarus. Even then, the Tut.by platform was actively used by the team of Nikolaev and Dmitriev. There was also Andrei Sannikov's Belarus. But due to the fact that the portal did not yet have the popularity that it acquired a little later, they passed 2010 without losses.
In 2011, on the wave of the terrorist attack in the subway and other events taking place in the country, they tried to rock the situation in Belarus for the first time. What was that? These were silent and clapping protests that are now almost forgotten. These events were intensely covered by the resource, and Zolotova set up journalists to attend such actions and support them in every possible way.
Belarusian journalists demand from the Prosecutor General's office and the Ministry of Internal Affairs to stop illegal detentions.
Another silent protest took place in Minsk. There are detainees.
The US and UK called for release of detainees during protests in Belarus.
It must be said that both then and later their editor-in-chief of Tut.by was an active stalwart of street protests. They said that Zolotova even declared her own readiness to take part in the confrontation on the streets with law enforcement agencies, following the example of the Ukrainian Maidan. The portal really showed itself in late 2013 and early 2014 when mass protests of Euromaidan supporters took place in Kiev. It was then that the protesters demanded the immediate signing of European integration laws. The disagreement of the current authorities was followed by violent clashes between protesters and law enforcement officers. They were accompanied by serious riots and numerous casualties. At the same time, Tut.by and expressly Zolotova herself as editor-in-chief chose the position of the Euromaidan, accompanying it with information and fixing this position with loud headlines.
At night, about 5,000 security forces attacked Euromaidan, but the Ukrainians defended it.
Soldiers of the special unit Berkut used tear gas against demonstrators who tried to break through to the main entrance to the building of the government of Ukraine.
Berkut broke through the barricades in Kiev and shoots at protesters. There are wounded.
Maidan gave Yanukovych several hours to release the detained activists. These were not just headlines, not just open support for the Euromaidan, but support for fratricidal war at first in Donbass, since the events in Ukraine 2013-2014 led not only to a change of power in Ukraine, but also became a catalyst for the geopolitical crisis that we are witnessing now. A rampant Nazism, the destruction of an undesirable language, Russophobia, the murder of civilians. This is what Tut.by voted for by choosing Euromaidan.
During incomplete 4 months of active street confrontations, the portal published almost 300 materials, all of which made the front page and received the highest number of hits. The emphasis in these materials was on the fairness of the protesters' demands, demonstrating the excessive use of force by the security forces and criticizing the current Ukrainian authorities. The right sector is ready to stop the bloodshed in the event Yanukovych's powers are abolished by the Rada.
The head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs appealed to the Ukrainians the police were giving combat weapons. In response, the protesters accelerated the production of Molotov cocktails.
You cannot shoot at your people. Interview with an officer of the intel troops of Ukraine who defected to the side of the protesters.
Vladimir Maiden who shot protesters with sniper rifles.
They also covered the speech of opposition politicians from Belarus, who also came there. All this was done in order to educate the Belarusian society to support the ideas of Euromaidan, and in fact, Tut.by was preparing the Belarusian society. We can say that in 2013-2014, the portal was testing the scheme according to which they covered all protest events in Belarus later.
It should be clarified that Tut.by isn't just articles, it's not just texts, it's also forums, comments, social networks.
Olga Loiko, editor-in-chief of the political and economic section of Tut.by from 2009 through 2021. She is charged under Article 243, Tax and Dues Evasion, Article 130, Incitement of Racial, Ethnic and Religious Races and Discord, Article 361, Calls for Actions Aimed at Inflicting Damage to National Security, currently wanted.
That is, if I use hyperbole metaphors to say that sanctions were imposed against some enterprise and everyone doesn't care what will happen to its employees, this is one situation. In the comments to the text there are, for example, statements that here you and your children naked and barefoot will go broke. That is, the level of escalation increases even more, and then in social networks, where there is even less control, threats are used to put pressure that we will find those responsible and take revenge, and the degree of incitement is already becoming prohibitive. Taking into account the entire infrastructure of the portal, it turns out that the escalation was carried out seriously and with the help of all possible methods, social networks, video, text, comments, that is, on all fronts, and each department at the same time was interested in ensuring that this happened. In 2010-15, Tut.by approached the presidential election with special precautionary methods. The fact is that Caesar read some materials personally. The rest were proofread by the then lawyer of Tut.by Media, Ludmila Chekina.
Ludmila Chekina, Director General of Tut.by Media from 2017 through 2021. She was the legal advisor in the structure of Tut.by since 2008. She is charged under Article 243, Tax and Dues Evasion, Article 130, Incitement of Racial, Ethnic and Religious Races and Discord, Article 361, Calls for Actions Aimed at Inflicting Damage to National Security, currently wanted. At the same time, the company was already developing a manual for the employees, a kind of set of rules that would allow not to violate the law covering the electoral campaign for the election of the head of state in Belarus. Caesar needed precautions to protect his brainchild from the painful ideas of Zolotova and her sudden movements and groundless quarrels with state authorities.
The role of the editor-in-chief is actually the key position in Tut.by Media, because this is a person who has practically no deputies, is not particularly inclined to delegate authority, and therefore this is a person who sees the entire portal, all its sections of all its services and development prospects, discusses the development line of the portal with the director and with commercial services. It's a key figure. I'd say it actually the first person of the company. She is a very sound, straightforward person. It's really impossible to argue, even if we discussed and planned that we shouldn't not do something. After the discussion is over, she could call and say, "Listen, after all, I decided that we would write this." The portal met 2015 with another portion of trouble. This time the portal's employees, traditionally taking a Russophobic position, were on the verge of a real criminal case. Then, at the end of September 2014, a conflict occurred in a large shopping center in Minsk, which among other things became a kind of result of the work of Tut.by under the leadership of Zolotova during 2013-2014.
In short, the man beat the child only for the fact that St. George ribbon was fixed on his backpack. Both sides of the conflict wrote statements to the police. The child's mother about the man's attack on her son, the man about the mother's attack on him. In reality, the mother simply stood up for the child, and the man subsequently apologized to her. At the same time, the portal took the position of the attacker. It presented the information in such a way that his actions, according to Tut.by, were fair and justified. Zolotova simply supported the Russophobic trend promoted then in the editorial office. The portal received an official warning for the dissemination of materials that could lead to incitement of social hatred. The warning forced Zolotova's activities to be brought under control. Zisser at first tried to present what happened as some kind of accident, but when the scale of the problem was explained to him, the owner of Tut.by traditionally stepped aside and tried to distance himself from the situation as much as possible.
Realizing that due to the activities of the portal there may be problems for the entire business, Zisser set up 8 new legal entitles, and Tut.by was withdrawn from the structure of his main asset at that time, reliable programs, so that the portal, in case of deviation from the plan, didn't pull the entire Zisser's business to the bottom totally. By itself, Tut.by was always unprofitable, never brought money. Among the top management there was such a saying that this is a very expensive toy of Yuri Zisser. It existed at the expense of his other business.
With such a hyped media platform, Zisser received both financial and reputational benefits. By and large, to a certain extent, thanks to the achievements of Tut.by, his business developed quite seriously and well, and his business was in the field of software production. But this was done by completely different firms that simply supplied money to the team that Zolotova had formed.
If the electoral campaign of 2010 and 2015 was covered relatively calmly, except for some moments when the journalists of the resource crossed the borders, but as for the events regarding socio-economic issues, for example, the growth of the dollar and the fall of the ruble, the resource added oil to the flame, escalating the situation in the foreign exchange market. We discussed with the leadership an idea to remove KPI completely, to remove these headline games aimed at increasing views, and to introduce our right to delete the most odious comments in the moderation. If we're making a report about production and betting on the KPI, this is one thing. If we're playing with topics much more complex, dangerous and so on, this is quite different. Let's say I'm in charge of the economy and big business, and several times during that time there were topics where I strongly insisted simply that there should be no KPI, no headline games, like the issue of devaluation of December 14 and August 16 or 17. In fact, I manually adjusted the headlines about the National Bank, as in reality even the dollar fell at the auction by 0.5%. It was people themselves who began to panic. This was the traffic out of nothing. That was just trading on the stock exchange. Any heading can be used to escalate the situation, like the dollar continues to grow rapidly and the ruble is in the bottom. That is, it's very easy to get high traffic with such a topic. Against this background, a situation happened that probably no one should have ever known about, as that was quite a different thing.
In 2015, Yuri Zisser was forced to justify himself to the financial police for an illegal currency exchange transaction. In fact, his brainchild helped the owner of Tut.by to make money by creating a currency crisis, actively criticizing the authorities, colorfully illustrating coups in exchange offices and the problems of private business. Being a VIP client of one of the leading commercial banks in the country, Zisser had a personal manager, but it was not profitable for him to sell currency through a bank. The manager arranged a meeting for the transaction past the cash register. The parties agreed on a favorable rate for them. After that, the bank's employee, on behalf of 2 different customers, withdrew the necessary amounts at the cash desk and brought them to the meeting room, where the exchange of almost $100,000 was made.
It seems to me that in the current situation this is a fairly characteristic side of Zisser and the model by which he conducted his business. Maintaining a balance with the government agencies was necessary for comfortable business. But when it was possible to circumvent the interests of the state, he did it without hesitation. You understand what it means to write on a mass portal. Let's say everybody rushed to the exchange offices, like dollars are about to end, and then it starts to unfold, and we realize that we're influencing this. This is our area of responsibility, that you cannot do that. There is such a thing as a self-fulfilling prophecy. We say some statements say the ruble will be falling for a long time, and our constant heating of this topic leads to the fact that the ruble is really falling because they start playing as if the ruble is really falling. They start buying currency. They start behaving as if it will fall. And when many people act like this, it really falls so. And the events of 2020 developed in the same way, but on a much larger scale. It is probably extremely difficult for one person to see this scale. Thousands of people gathered near the trial detention center at Volodarskaya Street and near Kupala Theatre.
How many people are considered missing after the elections in Belarus? We counted ourselves and asked the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
Doctors near the building of the Ministry of Health demand to let them into the detention center and hold in cells. The minister said how many people were killed and injured.
Hundreds of girls with roses gather near Komarovsky Market. A similar solidarity action is held in Russia.
Honestly, we had to say that you guys must not do that. But people are interested in what is happening, and if you constantly write about it, everybody will run to see what is going on, what kind of protest is going on, who is there near the Red Church walking and singing, maybe the KGB is there, and so on. And it turns out that in reality, we're even stirring up the interest, perhaps in such an artificial way.
A man went to a protest event and did not return. What should relatives do?
A daughter, a girl, and a mother are looking for their man. They disappeared on the 9th of August. It's still unknown where they are. On the 14th of August in 2020, the editorial board of Tut.by launched a service to search for those missing during the protests. On the 17th of August, an article with loud headline about almost 80 missing Belarusians, mostly men, is published. This headline turned out to be not only one of the most clickable in those days, but also the most quoted, with reference to this information about the alleged lawlessness and atrocities of the Belarusian regime in Belarus, after which people disappeared, was posted by liberal Russian, Belarusian and Ukrainian media. There was a tumult among the people. What happens if people go missing at protests? The fakes of Tut.by were debunked by the Minister of Internal Affairs, which called the allegedly missing people and posted phone conversations with them on the web.
This is Criminal Investigation speaking. Are you all right? Are you safe and sound? Yes, it's just people from Moscow could not find me and got scared. Thank you very much. Sorry to disturb you. Goodbye. Good evening. This is Criminal Investigation speaking. Are you all right? Are you safe and sound? Yes. Someone posted you on this site as missing. Well, I wasn't in the lists, that's possible. I see. I'd like to ask you, the information is incorrect. Could you please write there? Okay, they were supposed to correct it, but the information is renewed not at once and not everywhere. Good evening, this is Criminal Investigation speaking. Tell me, are you safe and sound? The thing is that you were posted on this site as missing. Yes, they have already called and inquired today. Everything is okay. Everything is all right then? Yes.
But all you had to do was call the people on the list before posting the fake on the front page of one of the most read resources in the country. But the task was too high. It had nothing to do with journalism. In the Telegram channel of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the press service left the following explanation.
Carefully tracked information about citizens who went missing on August 9th through 13th. The information often turns out invalid. The criminal police officers tracked the identity of more than 70 participants of unauthorized mass events held in the country from August 9th to 13th, whose data was published on the Tut.by portal and in various social networks. The information posted does not fully correspond to reality. Many of these citizens are at home and information about their search is not deleted in a timely manner. For example, of the entire list, only one woman is really missing. An application for her search was received by the police back on the 6th of August.
Simply put, the loud headline about 76 missing people was a fashion road for baths of cheap info fast food. No one figured out where the truth was. Such readers became a combat of Tut.by, and in particular its leadership against the state policy of Belarus. These same readers became participants in the attempt to overthrow the current government, victim of subtle manipulation with screen headlines and photos on the main page of the resource.
You know, it's very common in our country that a journalist who, for example, takes up arms becomes a participant in hostilities, a combatant. This opinion is based, of course, on some legislative norms, including the Geneva Convention, which defines the concept of a combatant by defining the concept of a journalist, albeit in the most general terms. I think that for any journalist who works in accordance with some professional principle of journalism, for any citizen, it is obvious that political activity is exactly the same weapon, sometimes often more dangerous than weapons, and the use of it by journalists under the guise of some general slogans, especially undercover, is no less dangerous than turning journalists into combatants on the battlefield. Tut.by, its team of journalists and the owners of Tut.by were also guided by certain norms. They were also guided by certain requirements, but apparently these requirements did not comply with the basic law of the Republic of Belarus. These were the rules of social responsibility or the mission of journalism. The reason was the conflict of interests. It does matter whether these were anti-state interests or rather, but the fact they did not comply with the state laws of the Republic of Belarus is obvious. This led to its logical conclusion.
It must be said that state bodies always communicated with the leadership of Tut.by, in particular with Marina Zolotova, almost always responded to their information requests, and often gave more information than to the state media. They proposed to cooperate. Even then, in 2020, Tut.by was offered to join the police in battle area and show the truth. But what was the answer? And did the supposedly unbiased free information resource need the truth? What kind of truth did they need at that critical moment for the country? Gennady Arkadьевich, you proposed to record an interview in this office. Why?
This is a memorable office. It was in this office that in August 2020 a meeting of media representatives with the Ministry of Internal Affairs took place. I personally met with representatives of such popular resources at that time as Onliner and Tut.by. It was on one of the nights in August 2020, the most difficult time here, when barricades were being built on the streets, tires were burning. It was when the protesters were fighting with the police, when we were being crushed by cars, when madness spilled out in the streets, which does not fit in the minds of Belarusians how it could happen. Then we invited the heads of these publications to this very room. Miss Zolotova was sitting in about that seat, and we offered them only one thing: to honestly and truthfully deliver the information that was going on, to talk about what is really happening on the streets, how the law enforcement is acting, what we want, what we are trying to achieve, what we are offering and what we are fighting against.
You said that this meeting took place at 2 o'clock in the morning, that is. It was such an urgent need?
Yes, the need was that we understood that the war was not only in the streets, the war was going on in the heads and media space, especially the internet space. Streams of lies poured out, streams of blood that literally pumped up the public opinion. We understood that the crowd in the streets is led not only by nectar. In many respects, this whole story is inspired and fueled by these resources, which had previously positioned themselves as independent analytical publications and so on. It turned out that it was not the freedom.
The reaction of the editorial board of Tut.by to political and acute socio-economic events was a kind of demonstration of disobedience to the official Minsk. Thus, the resource has accumulated so much negativity that it has become a potential red button for activating discontent in the Belarusian society. The principles by which we work are set out in our internal document, which is called Dogmas and Rules of the Editor of Tut.by, which states that we cover all events impartially, that our main task is to give a complete picture of what is happening in the country and the world. We have never been a platform to represent anyone's political interests. Marina Zolotova didn't stretch the truth when she spoke about the tasks of the resource, but were the tasks of Tut.by and the personal tasks of the portal management consonant. Surprisingly, in 3 sentences, Zolotova managed to lie 3 times. In general line and stealing turned out to be normal for the managers of the resource. Remember only the incident with stolen Belta content in 2018. From 16 to 18 years, more than 15,000 unauthorized connections. The employee of Tut.by in a personal conversation with Zolotova told it outright, "We steal it." Do you take the news in the open access, or do you take them from subscription without waiting for them to appear in the open access? I'll tell you honestly, I use the subscription. I don't even open the Belta site. Almost never, as it appears much faster, though without some additions. Therefore, in fact, we use it. We steal it. Who publishes the information first is more popular in the global network, and internet statistics is a great argument with advertisers who end up paying not the original source, but those who just quickly steal the news. This is what the monetization of other people's intellectual labor looks like according to Tut.by. The precedent was then traditionally pulled into the political plane. But this was not the first such incident here. In 2009, Interfax West banned the resource from reprinting its news for the same reasons. In 2018, there were fears among other owners, for example Voloshin, that perhaps Marina would begin to get nervous and stop normal communication with bosses and so on. So Voloshin asked me questions. What about your relations with the National Bank? The relations are good, as well as with the Minister of Finance. Why such questions? I was given the task that there should be good relations with these companies and organizations. I have good ones. Well, we are worried that Marina may get offended that the investigation committee has claims against her, then perhaps she will not be able to maintain normal healthy relations with state bodies. But in 2018 it seemed to us there were no such problems, that each department was responsible for relations with its own supervising state bodies, and in general there were no questions. Well, as it turned out in 2020 it didn't work. This turned out to be our delusion.
Coming up next.
Was Tut.by really there at that moment, since we saw no third-party journalist there at all? There was an objective of keeping a high degree of tension in the society.
Who moderated the forums on Tut.by?
At some moment it became clear that nothing good will come out of it.
What guidebooks did they follow?
Power rests only on bayonets. I believe it acceptable. These are opinions.
Who was scheming behind the back of the founder of Tut.by? You just don't tell the boss about it. Otherwise, all of us will become self-employed tomorrow. How did Tut.by get to the HTTP, and how much did the owners earn on it? These were really high amounts given the revenues of the HTTP. How Zisser's empire was torn apart after his death.
A special role in the effective operation of the media resource was played by comments under the articles, which were later moved to a separate legal entity in order to secure the portal itself. This was due to the increased responsibility of companies for comments under publications. And these are insults, inappropriate language, threats, calls for violence, extremism. I can say that all led to this. At some moment it became clear that nothing good will come out of it. We tried to keep neutral, while in fact we were not neutral. I think that as soon as the journalists take some side, it's very difficult to pretend that we are for everyone, just want to make it interesting for everybody and keep on working in the same way. We had a choice, either to get adjusted to the situation and become adequate, or do what we actually did. We felt to stop at the right moment.
My wife and I met here, and there are many such cases when people on the forums, after getting acquainted, formed families.
The Karkotsky spouses not only met on the forums of the resource, but later both were invited to simulate discussions for articles. The task of the moderators was to maintain a high degree of conversation and thus attract readers, interact with them and gently manipulate. Thus public opinion was formed by removing comments unwanted by the portal, creating an impression beneficial to the resource from the content read and viewed.
Tut.by paid quite serious sums to Talks.by under the contract for the maintenance of forum platforms. Accordingly, we know the well-known formula. he who pays the piper calls the tune.
The moderators in fact purposefully blocked uncomfortable opinions and comments during the electoral campaign of 2020, and the protests, comments supporting the destructive opposition began to actively appear under the articles of Tut.by. Among them, there were threats, provocations, and insults to the current government. Of course, the moderators of the forum had a question about which expressions can be skipped and which are not. They turned to the general director of Tut.by Media, Lyudmila Chekina. Subsequently, she prepared a rather interesting manual. The violent seizure of power by Lukashenko, the power of Lukashenko wrestled on bayonets, the unconstitutional seizure of power. I think this is acceptable. These are opinions. About the judges corrupt, etc. About the courts in general corrupt. If we're talking about courts and judges in general, I'd allow it. And about the genocide of the people, questions also arose. Genocide is a form of mass violence which the United Nations defines as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. The moderators asked to clarify this point again, if possible. My opinion is that, from the point of view of the correct application of this definition, we do not currently face genocide. At the same time, I do not believe that if someone expresses the opinion that genocide takes place, this should be removed. This opinion may be erroneous, but legitimate. Isn't it strange that a lawyer considers speculation to be legitimate, that is, information not supported by anything made on the basis of some personal preferences? Was it the lawyer who drew these conclusions? Or was it an ordinary activist who chose a side but not the law? Chekina deliberately supported provocations in the comments and the rocking of the situation in the country. She did it even without knowing what might follow. Lawlessness, legal default about the courts, the actions of the security forces, the statements of certain persons of the state. In fact, it turns out that everything is according to the law. I would leave all of that, that's an opinion. The country is a concentration camp, a genocide of the people, a country of ghettos, in general terms about the whole country, a provocation or not for those who do not adhere to this position. I suggest leaving it. Murders, terror, repressions about certain actions on the part of the security forces, the government, the authorities, provocation or not. No, not a provocation. This is an opinion. Journalists write about this. Why not allow commentators writing about it? It was clear to the naked eye that such instructions were not designed to extinguish the existing conflict of interest, but quite the opposite. The editorial board of Tut.by decided to support the attempt in Belarus by taking an active part in the information confrontation and, if you like, the coordination of protests.
I voiced on behalf of the Ministry of Internal Affairs a proposal to simply tell the truth, to stand next to us. We guarantee the safety of journalists of Tut.by, starting with personal protective equipment and up to personal security, asking only one thing: to be objective, to be honest, to show the picture from all sides and not just blood. In general, society and public consciousness were pumped with blood from all sides. Fancy my surprise when, without a shadow of a doubt, without any long thoughts, Miss Zolotov answered unequivocally, "No, we will act on our own." And it was after this meeting that these fakes were born: a lie about raped prostitutes, about a pregnant girl who lost her children, and about boys raped with sticks. By the way, this same boy is now on the international wanted list, successfully fighting in Ukraine on the side of the Nazis. All of it turned out to be a lie, and people saw that they were simply fed fakes. But at that time, we already understood that it was part of the information threat, information aggression, in fact, hybrid aggression that was unleashed against our country. Time has passed, and society came to its senses, and people came to their senses, and everything got back in its place, and the lie turned out to be just a lie. And now, if we are talking about Tut.by, the information resource is still an information resource. But in my opinion, it is no different from those information dumps, of which there are many on the internet, and is rapidly losing subscribers. It is overgrown with the most vile, stupid rumors and dirty fakes.
At the moment when Marina Zolotova refused your offer, did she somehow explain why this was the case?
No, she didn't explain. No one was interested in it. I repeat, our main task was to ensure public order, to ensure order in the country. For this, it was not only necessary to stand in combat formations on the street, it was necessary to convey the truth to people as much as possible, and when we saw a very clear and obvious reluctance to do this, we simply understood who is who.
Uliana Baboit is one of the former editors of Tut.by. In a conversation with her colleague, she doesn't hesitate to admit that the management of those very unauthorized mass events is more effective than the effect of chaotic crowd. For some reason, they decided to go along Железнодорожная street towards Malinovka. Yes, it's so surprising. I'm gonna look the column. Look, it took people the whole hour to hold a council. It cannot do without puppet masters. Everything revolved around the electoral campaign. When the protests began in the country, these sentiments were transferred to the editorial office. These protests most greatly influenced the work of the portal and influenced the topics that were chosen, the topics that the leadership set to cover, what articles were published. Let's say without several sources, the news would never have been put on the portal. If someone informs us about a strike, this is not a reason to put the news in any form, not in the social network, nowhere. In August, it became obvious to me that the rules are changing. It's possible. In fact, the rules changed long before August 2020. They existed, but deviations from them have been regular since 2010, depending on the situation. During the electoral campaign of 2020, these very deviations from the norm became more aggressive. Tut.by began to promote not just a specific position, without reference to the opinions of other parties, but outright lies. The ideal background for this was the COVID pandemic. At first, the editorial board of the resource supported the theme that at first the appearance of the virus, crematoriums started working in Belarus at full capacity. Then they chose a strategy of pressure on doctors and their demoralization. If you believe the headlines of Tut.by, as of 20 of May in 2020 in Bobruisk, doctors staged almost a revolution due to the alleged lack of additional payments, and the catalyst for the scandal was the BT film crew. I remember that day well, and I remember the reaction of my colleagues who went to Bobruisk to understand the problems that the doctors were worried about at that time. Maybe a week or two have passed since the well-known COVID allowances for doctors were introduced. In Bobruisk, ambulance doctors then appealed to the presidential administration to explain the situation. How in general should we deal with these allowances? It was not a simple situation, there were many requests, and then we went to Bobruisk to sort it out too, to respond to this situation, to understand how the local authorities worked there, what is happening in general. What surprised me that day, as I remember now, we were still there in Bobruisk, but even then my colleagues began to send me quite loud headlines. Probably one of the first was from Tut.by that wrote that the meeting turned into a scandal, that it was caused almost by the arrival of the BT crew. By the way, I can read it out now. In Bobruisk, ambulance doctors couldn't stand it when the state TV channel began to shoot a beautiful picture. The indignation of the doctors reached a peak when BT journalists began to shoot the story, inviting to the frame two ambulance employees who received the largest allowances under decree number 131. The other didn't like that state television wasn't interested in the discontent of the other 200 people and their letter to the president on this matter. Doctors began to speak out in the camera. BT journalists stopped shooting and left. In Bobruisk, ambulance doctors couldn't stand it when the state TV channel began to shoot a beautiful picture. The gathering has turned into a scandal. They wrote that it broke out because of BT journalists. The doctors disrupted the shooting for us. In fact, these were of course outrageous headlines because there was none of that. I had a question about whether Tut.by was actually, because to be honest, we didn't see any third-party journalists there at all. But it came from Tut.by. The so-called independent media reprinted all this in chain order with a similar subtext, and BT appeared everywhere. That is, I had an impression that doctors and general allowances, everything went by the wayside. No one was particularly interested in this. And what is most interesting, we were still there in Bobruisk when my colleagues sent me such headlines. We were still working, we weren't even going to leave. I remember you describing the situation in fiber. You said that it was calm enough. And at that point we were already opening Tut.by reading and couldn't understand because there were real inconsistencies. We wrote to you, asked you if everything was okay, is everything alright, because it was absolutely calm with no scandal at all. And in reality, what happened? Everything was absolutely calm. Anyone could come up to us and say, I want to say, yes please. We recorded real people with their impressions, both who were a little bit outraged and those who absolutely took this situation calmly because it takes time to sort it out. What conclusion did you draw about this situation, let's say being in a real situation, seeing the situation and reading the headlines of the so-called free media? The conclusion is probably simple. You can probably present information this way, having a fairly rich imagination. These media outlets had it. But as for journalistic ethics, I have a question for them. Well, this is another opportunity to shake up the situation a little out of nowhere. Well, of course, such attention is nice, but in such a situation I believe that it was absolutely legal and false information. And now let's look at the situation from the other side. The fact is that Tut.by had such a form of publication as online. That is, any of the readers could send news, photos on the topic, videos, the information was posted without verification. Actually, we initially had big questions about online because it was a very popular genre in terms of use. It included a lot of user news in almost real time. At the same time, there was practically no opportunity to verify this information. That is, the user reports that 200 people are protesting in Belarus, and in fact editors put it online immediately. It's impossible to verify the accuracy of this information, because the photo doesn't show exactly whether this is Belarus or not, whether there are 200 people or 20 people there, and what they are doing there, protesting, or they gathered in a queue waiting for something. Yes, that is in fact we give unverified information and thus obviously escalate the situation. That is, here I see the key problem, in fact, that the management didn't pay attention in a timely manner to the fact that it is the use of this complex platform that creates such pressure. As onlines were one of the most popular genres of the resource, Marina Zolotova, while addressing the editorial board, asked not to raise such ordinary topics as the weather or road accidents. Onlines were needed for something else, to promote political topics and the consequences of the elections, but not neutral, as you understand. She was interested in the topics where the authorities were exposed in a negative way, not otherwise. Let's agree that online is not all the events that take place in the country. It only showed the consequences of elections, protests, repression, reaction, etc. Statements, actions, trials, detentions, criminal cases, actually the actions of protest, support, solidarity and all that stuff, but not the weather, not the accidents. At the same time, it should be noted that Zolotova was well aware of the consequences of such a game, because the results of August showed the demand for this particular genre. It was in line that attracted readers and was the main one in terms of views. Throughout the month, online events were held timed to the hot agenda of the day. We continue to hold them to this day. The Belarusian elections attracted the attention of the whole world, which had an impact on the growth of Belarus feed coverage by 5 times, and the attention demanded even more.
You can talk a lot about the social responsibility of the media. You can talk a lot about the code of ethics of every journalist. It's all wonderful, it's all beautiful, and in some spherical world of journalism it must be present. But we live in a very difficult time, and journalists live in a difficult time, and the responsibility of a journalist in this difficult time should be regulated by his professionalism, his responsibility, the responsibility of his editor-in-chief, the responsibility of the media to the law on the media, to the basic law of the state, to the law on defamation. That is, a number of normative acts exist which regulate the actions of a journalist, the actions of the editorial board, the actions of the editor-in-chief, and so it turns out that this is the most important criterion of legal responsibility, which, in my opinion, determines the difference between professional journalism and amateur journalism, the journalism of bloggers and the journalism of anonymous Telegram channels. And whatever has flooded our lives lately, it is also interesting, it is also important, this is also necessary. There is a lot to learn from it, the speed of information dissemination and so on. But in my opinion, the main criterion of this responsibility is in choosing a source of information, especially in applying it in life, to some analysis based on this information. If I'm faced with the choice of receiving anonymous information from an unknown Telegram channel with unknown tasks, and receiving it from the media that will be responsible before the court, before the law in a case of defamation, in a case of the dissemination of false information, I naturally, as I'm not the first day in the profession, will choose the second one.
As with any major event, the editor-in-chief came up with a plan to cover the events in the days leading up to the election and after it. All departments were focused on covering this protest and election theme. There was a lot of activity, so in fact the entire portal was involved. They went to the enterprises where they asked questions to the workers about whether there were any protest activities there and so on. By the way, it could also contribute to the events because if at the exit from your enterprise they come up and ask, well, how are you on strike? Then this creates a certain background and a feeling that everyone around is on a strike. Probably I'm not the only one on a strike.
In Bobruisk, they are discussing that BOLSHE is on strike. We checked. We demand an end to the violence. What happens on 11th of August at the enterprises of the country? The global demand is the resignation of Lukashenko. How enterprises go on strikes and rallies against the backdrop of detentions of protesters and strike leaders. What was the 16th day of protest in Belarus like?
Anything, a lady and the police officer, a theater poster, could all be involved in this topic, and the resource raised only this protest theme. How to protect your pet during the protests. Crying all days long, the beauty salon will render free service to all girls who were injured during the week. One of the organizers of female protests in Minsk. Their girls are afraid to be beaten, but there are other fears that are stronger.
Here is some other advice for security officers willing to quit the service. Belarusian girl painted a picture with their hair and is going to present it to those who will donate money to the victims. IS Soft donates $500,000 to help the victims.
At the same time, things that current government was doing went to the background or were covered from the negative side. The portal began to show one-sidedly what is happening in the country both before the events of August 9 and after August 9. Plus, a lot of my colleagues succumbed to these protest moods. I know they went out to protest. It was encouraged and not discouraged by the leadership, and the leadership knew about it and influenced our work.
When there was Yuri Zisser, everything was much softer on Tut.by. As far as I know, he has often slowed down the most harsh editors, for instance, editor-in-chief Zolotova. Probably the general mood depended on it.
The main difficulty was that they needed posting, so that there were a lot of messages. The messages were different, but again, we couldn't let everything on the air, no matter how they demanded it from us, because there were responses with specific messages. It all started with the fact that the editorial office took some topics, forwarded to us the questions about why we deleted it, and for each message they wrote why it was deleted, that this is unacceptable, some calls provocations, and in response we had to somehow be guided by what they wanted us to do, because it didn't really fit into the rules. Did you agree with what was suggested to you? No, and in most cases the guys disagreed too, because it didn't fit into the rules. In the case when one of the moderators deleted frank or even aggressive extremist comments, there was an immediate reaction from the editorial board, which demanded that such comments from the moderators were left. But the comments of the pro-government side caused other emotions in the same Voloshin.
Kirill Voloshin, co-founder of Tut.by Media, escaped from Belarus to Lithuania in September 2020. Voloshin took an active part in an attempt to split and sell the media resource after Yuri Zisser's death. He is charged under Article 16 criminal participation, Article 243 tax and dues evasion, currently wanted. Hello. Why do we have so many pro-Lukashenko's comments under the ultimatum article? Do only Lukashenko's stalwarts write comments? Can they be removed or disabled today?
I asked the producers to look and contact the moderators if there are problems.
Delete this section and the discussion online then. There's a lot of frustration for the strikers.
I will clarify the opinion of my colleagues.
Strike of forums.
I'm wroth against it. I'm gonna find out from my colleagues. I'm also in favor of forums working. The thirst for profit simply didn't allow the general director of the resource Lyudmila Chekin and her deputy for commercial issues Ksenia Ivanova to make the right decision, to turn off the forums. They decided to play an all-or-nothing game. Why has the rhetoric changed in 2020? It's because Zizer's influence waned at a certain point and then he passed away. I think that's probably the key reason. And someone decided to make a bet that perhaps the government in Belarus will change. So we were given the instructions to cover the position structures. In particular, Voloshin often began to throw us these topics after August. It was necessary to understand what this is connected with. When a person himself is in Lithuania, a person is involved in this wonderful atmosphere of high slogans. Naturally, it seems to him that it's very important to highlight it on the portal. No one was interested in the work of state bodies, because this is routine work. What interesting can be said brightly and cheerfully about the harvesting campaign? It's important. This is directly important for the security of the state, but it's not as bright and not as interesting as loud statements about the great achievements of the Republic of Belarus with the onset of a bright future, especially when you are there and you are from the other side and you actually see it and dream about it. It seems to you that the whole of Belarus directly lives like this. It's contagious, as it turns out. That is, being in Lithuania, not being involved here in opposition activities. He told how to work properly and how important it's to cover every opposition stream, every statement, every trip, despite the fact that it's obvious to everyone that the 25th trip is not even to the leader, but to the head of MFA. What can you squeeze out of this? Some kind of a reason for the news occasion, in fact, a poor reason. How did the editorial board react to the fact that Voloshin is sitting in Lithuania giving instructions? Did they at all understand where the instructions were coming from? I think not so much. The history of Tut.by and this confrontation with the state began not in 2020, but long ago. What is your opinion, your assessment?
My opinion is that Tut.by was born as an independent media of a new format, which can impartially and very quickly convey some information to the Belarusian society as efficiently as possible and in understandable language. Indeed, this story as part of the information aggression began long before 2020, probably starting from 2010-2011. We began to understand that this publication and many other sources began to parasitize on the topic of criticism of the state in terms of law enforcement. We began to understand that a police officer is given an image of an enemy, first discredited and then demonized. In their understanding of post-Soviet people, a citizen of young Belarus, a police officer has always been a protector. A police officer was like Uncle Stopper, who can come to the rescue to protect, find, neutralize the criminal and so on. And then there emerged a lot of bloggers, and then there was Tut.by, which began in every way to discredit any information about the application of law enforcement, was clearly presented with a minus sign. We tried to work with this resource. We gave interviews, we gave comments on any occasions, even the most sensitive and painful for the internal affairs bodies. Nevertheless, we always tried to be honest and objective. We prepared press conferences. We were ready to communicate on the most topical, most acute topics, but we saw only rejection and misunderstanding, which were fully manifested from August 2020 onwards.
Against the background of the protest environment and people's interest in non-standard situations, confrontation, the viewing rates began to grow, as well as the number of negative comments. Everyone in the media knows that the highest-rated programs are programs about emergencies, murders, fights and crimes. So, against the background of hunt, Tut.by started collecting fruit. The growth of views and comments is an increase in the number of ads and other non-free interactions with customers, on which in fact the media earn, unless of course they sell their own content. And that wasn't the case of Tut.by. Therefore they tried to get the most out of the protest on the 9th of August and subsequent unauthorized events on the Belarusian streets.
Kowalkow and Dolevsky get 10 days in jail, police vans at the Ministry of Education and appreciating currency. National Bank about exchange rates, lack of dollars in exchange offices, and whether it will impose restrictions. Tikhanovskaya spoke in the European Parliament. My country is in crisis. volunteers and doctors about how medical care is provided at protests and how riot police behave with them. Novopolotsk woman will be tried for drawing a white-red-white flag on the asphalt. She was taken to the police with her 4-year-old son.
So the system of containment and balances that has always been there when we recall Zisser just lost its relevance in 2020. The leadership told me about this outright. When there were any doubts, I asked if we were crossing the red lines. Zolotova told me directly that we made our choice. At that moment, I realized that classical journalism remains in the past. It's actually about activism. That is, the protest topic was mostly in the spotlight. The leadership gave instruction to write a lot about opposition leaders. We even had more than once conversations about our cases, for example. That we shouldn't write about every step of Tikhanovskaya because, well, this is a very serious bias. And how could we keep a balance when we were told to monitor her activities? That is, I could resist as much as I wanted, but in the end, if necessary, I sat down and wrote, as I was forced, because that's my job. Yes, I'm a subordinate person, I'm not a leader. I can't just stand up and say I'm not going to write. There is such a thing in psycholinguistics as the image of the enemy. This image is also created by selecting linguistic means such as rhetorical questions, metaphors, comparisons, up to making rhyme and poetic forms that changed meanings. Naturally, all these techniques were used by the authors. This is especially evident. This emotional component is about the separation of the two camps. The protesters who are bright, joyful, beautiful, incomparable, and all the others who oppose them, and the current government and pro-state people. Such contraposition within the nation is the incitement of social enmity or discord. Methods of escalation were used both in articles and in comments which the portal management refused to close, thereby maintaining a high degree in society.
In fact, during the investigation of the criminal case, a number of articles were established that contained signs of an extremist orientation, and the information activity of Tut.by media itself was aimed at inciting social hatred or discord on the basis of other social affiliation, which was subsequently established, among other things, by experts of the Republican Expert Commission.
Particular efforts were made to oppose readers against certain categories of citizens. For example, the article Top 10 Judges Who Gave the Highest Number of Days to Administrative Detainees. In particular, the judge here is called especially ruthless. The emphasis is placed on the vulnerable features of bringing to administrative responsibility a certain category of protesters. For example, mothers of many children, creative persons, the wrong persons mistakenly taken. In this way, the author makes this manipulation. The emphasis is placed on the involvement of certain categories of citizens for the committed acts. It is proportionate to the articles of the law under which they were involved. For example, he just stripped vegetation from flower beds and fruit at police officers, ripped off a balaclava from a riot police officer, and so on. And the fact that it happened near the barricades is omitted. Narrow fragments are taken out of the police reports, the information of the judicial bodies, and interpreted in a different way. The reader, the recipient, has a picture of universal lawlessness, suppression, repression, destruction of the state, lack of democratic values.
I'm not scared anymore. The stepson was beaten at a Krestina, and the stepfather went to the square. Disaster strikes and patience come to an end. Professor on why Belarusians took to the streets. In Brest, riot police brutally detained a Tut.by correspondent. In Minsk and Grodno, security forces attacked other journalists.
Putting the most outrageous remark in the headline is a favorite trick of former Tut.by authors. The appeal of this approach is that nothing threatened for quoting someone else's speech, and they used others to pull chestnuts out of the fire. They deliberately made a biased selection of quotes and headlines with negative epithets, with non-existent actions of the security forces. According to the experts' conclusions, these are purposeful, regular actions of the authors that led to a certain result. For example, the main idea is to use this quote as the title. It's advantageous for the authorities to hide the cause in a black box of police torture cameras. these same torture chambers are highlighted in bold. What hits the eye attracts attention. In fact, this is just a quote, the opinion of some insignificant enough person. The regular selection of these episodes in the materials, for example, of Tolkacheva, and the actual absence of any other point of view represented, shows that the author supports exactly this position. It was necessary to constantly maintain high degrees in society so that the protest didn't subside, so that people reading such texts continued to go out on the street. At that moment I didn't realize what I was doing. If there was an opportunity to rewind everything, would you change anything in your life? I wouldn't have written all that. You understand this, face it today, but at the time I was doing my job and didn't know where it could lead. It seemed to the media employees then that they were celestials, but from the very first days people saw who was who and didn't hesitate to express their position. On the forums at Tut.by, the comments of those who disagreed with the coup were cut out. On the street everything was different. Do you understand what you are doing? You provoke people. You pit people against each other. Tut.by is an accomplice to this outrage in Belarus. When the same happened in Ukraine, I wouldn't believe how people could fight against each other. We present the unbiased information. No, you are not unbiased. People can't analyze the information you present. Sorry, you are their accomplices. I hope you will come to your senses when you see the result. God forbid that it will happen here. I hope to God authority will take hold. Maybe I'm not for Lukashenko, but I'm for authority, for order. Slag people need authority. Stop it. If you are not tired of it, leave to other country. In the criminal case of Tut.by, 18 officials of the company are accused. Among other things, they are charged with crimes related to the evasion of taxes in a particular large amount. Some of the defendants gave confessions, compensated the state for damage in the amount of 3 million and even petitioned the president for exemption from criminal liability. When the media reported that the employees of Tut.by had robbed the state, a lot of people were bewildered. It seems to be impossible, and why all this was needed by such a large honest resource fighting for justice. They didn't believe it. I will break down the nuances to show the true face of the supposedly liberal press and in fact liars, manipulators and chiefs. Colleagues, today we submitted TBM documents to the High Technology Spark. I strongly request you during this important period to refrain from criticizing the HTP and in general from any harsh criticism of the state and social networks. I hope for your understanding. This is a screenshot of the message of the General Director of Tut.by for 2019, when the desire to suck as a parasite to state preferences and benefits was above any kind of private ambitions and a sense of self-superiority adherent to the resource. At that point, the owners of Tut.by, that is, those interested in increasing their income, froze in anticipation of a decision that could significantly improve their financial situation. In fact, such a playful obedience was due not only to the desire to join the HTP, but also to hide the shortcomings of their business plan. To put it simply, to deceive.
After considering the business project during the scientific and technical examination by members of the Expert Council of the High Technology Spark, Tut.by Media decided to create a new legal entity, Publisher Box. This was necessary in order to transfer from Tut.by Media to Publisher Box the activities prohibited to the HTP resident.
Tut.by Media representatives got interested in joining the high-tech park when the 8th decree of the President on development of digital economy was adopted, which actually allowed promising and technologically advanced enterprises to expand their activities. The main condition for HTP resident was the use of proprietary software or software developed with the participation of HTP resident and receipt of the corresponding revenues for it. At the same time, do not forget about saving on taxes, because the residents of the park are also provided with benefits. So why did the so-called tops of the media resource decide to enter the HTP? To cut taxes and increase their own income. It certainly wasn't the development of high technology, because in fact they didn't have their own developments. The leadership came and said that we were joining the HTP. My personal wish was that we didn't go there because I had something like intuition. I also didn't understand how could we be an IT company. I've always understood that benefits are a big responsibility when it comes to huge amounts. Considering how much Tut.by was paying before joining the HTP, after I sent 5 inquiries on the types of activities, eligible, not eligible, the HTP leadership said, "Why only now beginning to budge?" This question is certainly not for the average employee, but the answer is on the surface: money. There are people who never know when they get enough.
During the investigation, correspondence was established between the main founders of Tut.by Media, they were called TOPs, where they discussed selling part of the shares to foreign investors, including representatives of the Russian Federation. Accordingly, the market coefficient was calculated by minimizing tax costs in connection with residence in the HTP.
At night, Chekina asked to calculate the appraisal. We have to figure it out. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation and amortization for 2019 multiplied by 6 equals 22. It was 2018. At that time, I understood that our IT company, Reliable Programs, is already a resident of the HTP, and the ongoing pressure apparently had something else to do with it. At that point, I had an idea that there must be some other company willing to join the HTP, but Tut.by isn't suitable for this anyway, because it's a media. It's a mass media registered as a mass media. The company doesn't have its own developments. Apparently, this is the reason why the resource didn't become resident of the park at the first attempt. It happened later. They really wanted to get state preferences. At that time, none of the Tut.by leadership thought that they would soon be ordering that Alexander Lukashenko not be called president of Belarus from a certain time in their articles, because the government could suddenly become illegitimate, and sanctions against Belarus would become the most expected event for Belarusians in a year according to Tut.by. But in spite of this, the portal was satisfied with the tax benefits during 2020, yet not with the current government. When Tut.by became resident of the HTP in the fall of 2019, the company received serious benefits. It should have probably influenced our salary, but I didn't notice that. But Lyudmila Chekina and other co-founders of the company noticed a change in their income after the legal entry of the resource into the number of HTP residents. After all, they have got a tax haven. As a result, for 6 months, the salary of the general director Chekina amounted to a little more than 360,000 Belarusian rubles, of which a little less than 70 rubles were deducted to the pension fund. A non-resident in this case would pay about 3,500. What does your accounting experience tell you? Why were they so eager to join the HTP? What was the goal of those who led and who established Tut.by? When Yuri Zisser was alive, for him it was more prestige. He would be proud to be an HTP resident. When he died, the decision was made. I don't even know who made the decision. Probably it was done to get additional benefits and, accordingly, additional dividends. If we take into account that Tut.by was paying about 1 million Belarusian rubles of tax per quarter, this is VAT and profit. All this could be redirected to the payment of dividends. Dreams are not taxed. This entry was found in the notebook of the General Director of the Media Resource. I believe that everyone understands well that this phrase means, and what risks Lyudmila Chekina was willing to take in order to realize her dream. In addition, during the analysis of information extracted from the computers of the defendants, a file was found that contained the entry "We not so much develop Tut.by, but rather extort money." But Vadik can come up with something for the high-tech park.
The purpose of this entry was not to mention in the business project that they are not really developing a product for the development of new and high technologies, but rather monetizing it, using it for their own selfish purposes.
So what was this service? This is a database about goods and services presented on the internet resource Tut.by. The terms of the contract were formally changed to meet the conditions of the HTP resident, but in fact numerous links lead to the resources of Yandex Market, which confirms the use of third-party software for money.
During the investigation, the employees of the administration of the high-tech park Members of the expert council and the supervisory board were interrogated. They testified that, taking into account the circumstances established by the investigation, Tut.by media had no grounds for joining and being among the residents of the high-tech park.
In mid-May 2021, officers of the Financial Investigations Department searched the businessman who, according to investigators, illegally used the conditions of the HTP tax haven. The advanced product wasn't produced. They used the Russian digital platform, deceiving both the park and the budget. That is, every Belarusian, from a pensioner and a state employee to an entrepreneur who pays taxes regularly and in full. $100,000 of cash of unknown origin was stored in dog food. But the search revealed the amount equal to $500,000. The owners of the resource deceived the HTP, the tax and budget of the country, for millions of dollars. Moreover, they were going to take them abroad. The main purpose, as I've said, is safe storage of money and savings. The main money flows will be our earnings in Belarus that we are going transferred to your bank to be stored there. When he was in Riga, Kirill wrote that a one-time payment of 1.5 is planned, which will be followed by 100,000 a month. Yes, exactly. For quoting extremists, the portal was blocked and never revived. It's amazing how literally in half a year after Zisser's death, his empire was essentially destroyed. I would say it was abused in a vile way, with mockery and particular hypocrisy. I'm gonna show you the correspondence between the owners of Tut.by with the participation of Zisser. Does anyone mind if I put this text in per tricks? Not all Telegram channels are equally useful. Colleagues, recently some Telegram channels started posting fabrications on the topic, are they going to sell the portal Tut.by? I officially declare all these rumors absolutely groundless. The owners have no plans to sell Tut.by in whole or in part. I'm for it. Perhaps it's better if Euro will say it.
Posted.
The founder of Tut.by, Yuri Zisser, died on the 17th of May in 2020. His illness became known in 2016. From that moment on, Zolotova started actively achieving her own ambitions at the expense of the others. Thanks to her systematic work, Zisser's once promising brainchild was branded an extremist resource. But long before his death, co-owners of Tut.by began to think about how to sell the resource, how to get more dividends, how to increase its market value, hence the attempt to hype during 2020 election campaign, to attract more attention to it not only from readers but also from buyers. Zisser was gone, and all power got in the hands of Zolotova, Chekina, Voloshin and Ivanova. People who even during Zisser's lifetime in correspondence among themselves stated that if Yuri finds out, we would all become self-employed. But they were trusted, they were relied upon. But personal ambitions, thirst for profit and the desire to circumvent the law, violating all imaginable, inconceivable boundaries of what is permissible, led Tut.by to the cemetery of media resources. Bye-bye Tut.by.